Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is on a concept that's generated a lot of discussion within peer mental health and disability spaces. Specifically, how individuals can manage boundaries and maintain their autonomy when they're navigating systems that often demand compliance over self-respect.
And right at the heart of this is a concept from the source material called lawful isolation. It's a term that, it really demands our attention because, on its face, it sounds almost counterintuitive to the idea of community building.
It does. It really does. And the author defines lawful isolation not as a retreat, but as a very intentional, ethical, and legal decision. It's the measured choice to limit or even completely stop contact with people or situations that repeatedly cause harm or violate boundaries. It's meant to be a proactive mechanism.
And the implications of that choice, of making it so foundational for the individual, are just vast, which I think leads us directly to our central question for today. Is lawful isolation, as it's defined here, a necessary, empowering mechanism of self-governance for people in these complex systems? Or does this framework, by prioritizing individual disengagement, inadvertently risk undermining the essential demands for collective reform and the integrity of these shared community spaces?
My stance is that lawful isolation is an essential, even professional, act of self-governance. I'd argue it's the necessary prerequisite for anyone trying to achieve stability and long-term health, particularly when they're expected to tolerate intrusions that, frankly, others would just walk away from.
And I'll be exploring the potential risks in framing self-protection primarily through this lens of individual withdrawal. I want to question whether that kind of disengagement is really a sufficient response when the underlying issues are so systemic and seem to require a collective insistence on, transparency and ethical behavior.
Well, my position really rests on this idea that the concept is fundamentally an act of self-governance. The author is explicit that it's an affirmative choice that supports well-being, and they take great pains to distinguish it from just, avoiding conflict. It's grounded in basic rights, the right to privacy, the right to consent about who gets access to you, and the freedom from harassment or unwanted surveillance. The choice is professional because it operates within these clear ethical and legal boundaries.
That emphasis on the legal and ethical framework is important, I agree, but I do believe it highlights a pretty significant tension.
But consider the context. The author is operating in these complex bureaucracies, dealing with people labeled consumers or disabled adults. The material points out that this group is just habitually expected to tolerate behaviors that others would not. Things that range from passive aggression to, outright monitoring. So this strategic disengagement provides a specific, measured, and a non-emotional response to that expectation. It moves the individual from a state of reacting to maintaining.
I'm not questioning the right to self-protection, not at all, or the immediate need to set strong boundaries against things like passive aggression and unsolicited contact. Those are absolutely vital for survival.
See, I'd say it's about more than survival. It's about sustainability. The text emphasizes building structures that support sustainability rather than survival. It's about allowing for growth without chaos and progress without burnout. And lawful isolation helps achieve this by protecting the individual's foundational capacity to just function with dignity.
That is a compelling goal, certainly, though I would probably frame the means to get there a bit differently. While ethical boundaries are, of course, critical for the individual, a reliance on lawful isolation, on this strategic disengagement as the primary solution, it risks minimizing the need to demand that transparency and mutual respect within the shared spaces themselves. The author champions the idea of healthy peer communities that rely on lawful conduct, appropriate boundaries, and respect.
But how can you participate in creating a healthy community when that very community, or the system it's in, is actively eroding your health through constant intrusion?
But if the primary tool we're advocating for is the individual's removal of access, that is isolation, we have to ask if that truly aligns with strengthening those communities. If, as the source material suggests, surveillance, rumor, or monitoring is normalized within a service system, then focusing on an individual's removal risks conceding that territory to the very dysfunction we're trying to fight. It's treating the symptom, not the structural cause.
I see why you'd think that, and it does speak to this tension between self-care and collective action. But let me pivot to why this specific form of isolation is strategically superior. It's designed to be highly effective because it, and I'm quoting here, interrupts these patterns without escalating conflict and, crucially, removes access rather than fueling reaction.
Could you elaborate on what you mean by fueling reaction?
Well, the projector, the person or this system causing the harm often thrives on the target's reaction. Emotional responses, public arguments, even just trying to explain your boundaries over and over. That can all become fuel for the dynamic. The professional, legal assertion of lawful isolation just sidesteps this entirely. It protects the individual's nervous system, their clarity. It's not an emotional exit. It's a clinical and legal boundary assertion that preserves self-respect and the capacity for healthy relationships down the road.
I understand the tactical advantage there of interrupting a harmful pattern, but I'm still not convinced that isolation should be seen as the highest form of professionalism, especially if it leads to abandoning shared spaces. The material is very specific about the insidious nature of this harm, calling out something it terms passive trajectories.
Right, and for clarity, passive trajectories are the channels the harm travels through, so places, systems, routines, even technology that distort reality and erode trust, often through indirect means like gossip or insinuated monitoring.
Exactly. So if these distortions are traveling through entire professional places or state-mandated systems, doesn't lawful isolation risk just conceding those spaces to dysfunction? When the author talks about the necessity of community integrity, retreating from the very arena where those standards need to be defended seems like a major oversight. How can we expect professional alignment if we're constantly disengaging from information, environments, relationships that are part of the system?
And that's where the distinction between total withdrawal and selective disengagement is so critical. The author posits that consumption is participation, meaning if you stay engaged with harmful information or environments, you are, in a sense, feeding the disruption. You're contributing to the burnout. This isn't about leaving the system entirely. It's about choosing which streams of information, which relationships, which routines you will no longer give your energy to.
But how does that translate into long-term systemic health? The withdrawal, yes, it fixes the immediate harm to the self, which is vital, but it doesn't necessarily dismantle the broken passive trajectories. That rumor channel stays open. The intrusive reporting requirement stays in place.
The withdrawal fixes the capacity for the individual to eventually engage on their own terms. Lawful isolation is about releasing what compromises your well-being. It establishes a necessary condition for safe, healthy participation later on. It is an act of self-governance. Think about it this way. Say an individual is in a process with multiple mandatory meetings. If one of those meetings consistently has an observer who's known to violate confidentiality, lawful isolation isn't quitting the whole system. It's asserting the legal right to cease participating in that specific meeting, protecting their stability for the essential ones.
I do appreciate that narrowing of the scope, but that leads us straight to the next practical problem. The author is reflecting while operating within critical services, mental health systems, disability services. If the channels of harm, these passive trajectories, are embedded in systems you need for essential care, how does lawful isolation allow someone to get support without immediately being labeled uncooperative or difficult?
I think that common fear, the fear of being labeled, is precisely the expectation lawful isolation is designed to dismantle. That fear is rooted in the toxic idea that people must tolerate behaviors that others would not in exchange for services. Lawful isolation is the mechanism to assert, professionally and legally, I do not have to remain accessible to what harms me in order to be considered compliant or worthy of care.
But that assertion of rights, however correct it is, often just hits a wall of bureaucratic rigidity. A care provider might see a patient lawfully isolating from, say, a required support group, and they'll just document that as a lack of engagement, which could compromise future services. The reality of these systems often demands outward compliance.
But the focus on informed choice and ethical boundaries is the commitment to professionalism here. It shifts the power dynamic from compliance to consent. Lawful isolation requires documenting why the disengagement happened, citing the specific violations, the right to privacy,
It distinguishes between necessary consensual engagement and intrusive monitoring. It demands clarity. The individual isn't just isolating randomly. They're isolating lawfully and ethically based on established rights.
The challenge remains, though, that the definition of what triggers this could be too broad, risking social fragmentation. The material correctly identifies clear violations like stalking, but it also includes subtle behaviors like insinuation or observation without consent,
Which the author correctly identifies as behaviors that create immense psychological strain. When people are subjected to that, they feel watched rather than supported. The harm is real, even if it's indirect.
Oh, agreed, the harm is absolutely real, but if the threshold for enacting lawful isolation is set at perceived insinuation behaviors that can be unconscious or subject to interpretation, we risk immediate fragmentation within peer spaces. These are communities built for mutual support, which rely on the difficulty of maintaining open relationships. If the first recourse to perceived indirect hostility is a permanent lawful disengagement, are we promoting resilience or are we promoting fragility?
I'd say we're promoting dignity, which is the foundation for resilience. Lawful isolation is a demand for transparency and consent. If a person feels perpetually watched, they cannot trust or heal. Therefore, the ethical response is to remove their accessibility. This choice supports their long-term health, ensuring they maintain the capacity to form genuine, trust-based relationships elsewhere or later on. This isn't fragility. It's a sophisticated application of boundaries.
But the goal of these spaces is often mutual aid, collective advocacy. If every individual retreats to manage their own nervous system, the moment a passive trajectory occurs, we're left with a collection of highly protected, isolated individuals and no shared space left to reform. The integrity of the community relies on facing these issues together.
I would counter that the integrity of the community is built one healthy individual at a time. Lawful isolation ensures the individual is healthy enough to eventually return to engagement on their own terms. If someone is continually traumatized by the system they are trying to fix, they become useless to the fight. Survival has to come first.
And that is a powerful argument. But if we accept that, then who carries the burden of demanding the system change? Who remains behind to demand that those channels of harm are actually closed?
The act of disengaging lawfully, professionally, and with documentation is a professional demand for change. It refuses complicity. It creates a formal record of why the system failed to provide a safe environment. It shifts the burden of proof back to the system to clean up its act if it wants to engage with that individual again.
That assumes the system will respond to that legal assertion, which is often not the case. The fight for reform still requires collective pressure, which isolation, by its nature, can undermine.
To reiterate my core position then, lawful isolation is a critical, proactive act of self-governance. It is the necessary bridge for individuals navigating systems where intrusion is normalized. It's the mechanism that moves a person from reactive survival to deliberate sustainability, upholding their fundamental right to dignity and safety.
And I maintain that while that self-protective impulse is absolutely necessary, the practice of lawful isolation must rigorously balanced against the imperative to demand collective accountability. We have to ensure that individual protection, through withdrawal, doesn't inadvertently undermine the collective fight for community integrity, leaving these toxic systems completely unchallenged.
It's a profound, maybe even irreconcilable tension in these kinds of environments.
It is. Both frameworks clearly prioritize clarity, consent, and respect. The fundamental tension we've explored really lies in whether sustained wellness is best achieved through self-governed withdrawal, the lawful isolation, or through a more rigorous, sustained, and ethical engagement intended to force change from within.
And the material certainly suggests that for those under constant pressure, the former is often the prerequisite for the latter. You have to remain whole enough to fight another day.
A point well taken. But the cost of that withdrawal to the broader community's capacity for reform is a cost we must continually assess.